2:14 a.m., at the command center of a Southern Command officer after the briefing. Deep inside Doral, Florida, the radar screens simultaneously turned blood red. This was not a cargo plane gone off course. This was not a test, not a failure from a private corporation. This was the sign of the apocalypse. Massive heat signatures were rising from the atmosphere. The source was unmistakable: Pinar del Rio Province, western Cuba, just a short distance from Key West. The North American Aerospace Defense Command, NORAD, sent an emergency alert straight to the Oval Office. Multiple objects were flying along ballistic trajectories. Target, Florida. The threat was suspected to carry nuclear warheads. John F. Kennedy's worst nightmare had come true 65 years later. 1 minute later, the southern Miami night sky was torn apart, not by lightning, but by an artificial sun. A blinding blue flash completely engulfed Homestead Air Force. A mushroom cloud, though small, of devastating power, began to rise. The shockwave shattered windows. Tens of miles away, the White House received the final report. For the first time since 1945, the United States had been attacked with nuclear weapons. A few hours earlier, Washington had imposed a full-scale embargo, and ultimately a total stranglehold, on maritime and air routes, aimed at changing the regime in Havana. And now Havana retaliated, not with a diplomatic note, but with fire and steel. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 had returned. But this time, those deadly missiles had actually been launched. The roots of this firestorm did not begin with a missile. It began with a document, a comprehensive and final U.S. embargo. This was no longer ordinary economic sanctions. This was a modern military blockade. Washington announced the complete closure of its airspace and territorial waters around the island. Every ship and every aircraft, whether civilian or humanitarian, was forbidden to approach. The intention was not hidden. This was a deliberate act of strangulation, aimed at bringing down the Havana government from within. To the Pentagon, this was the final move, to eliminate the thorn 90 miles off the coast of Florida. But for Havana, this was an unofficial declaration of war. They were cornered. There was no way back, and a nation with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous of all. The whole world was mistaken. Washington was mistaken. They believed the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 had ended when Khrushchev bowed his head and withdrew the R-12 and R-14 missiles back to the Soviet Union. They believed Cuba was left with only AK-47 rifles and old T-55 tanks rusting away. But they forgot one thing: the pride and survival will of a revolution. Deep beneath the dense limestone of the Sierra de Los Órganos Mountains, within a system of caves, naturally formed and transformed into an underground fortress, a secret buried for 6 decades, a special unit, top secret within the Cuban Revolutionary Armed Forces, was never disbanded. They were the final guardians of the Soviet legacy. In tunnels, where temperature and humidity were meticulously controlled, lay 6 R-12 Dvina ballistic missiles in silence. NATO designated them as SS, for Sandal, Cold War monsters. They were liquid-fueled weapons, technology from the 1950s, with a range of 1,200 miles. American reconnaissance, with radar, using the most advanced synthetic aperture and infrared sensors, never found them. Because they weren't hidden in open-air silos. They were buried deep underground, disguised beneath ordinary tobacco farms. And the most terrifying part, the warheads. The 1962 agreements required the Soviet Union to. The Soviets withdrew the nuclear warheads, but Cuban engineers, with the help of foreign specialists, over many decades, had secretly harvested and maintained fissile materials from alternative sources, the strategic assumption being that they had succeeded in preserving at least 4 nuclear warheads, tactical, low-yield types, of only 510 kilotons each, not city-destroying weapons, but weapons designed to obliterate military targets. They were not torpedoes, they were dirty bombs, but dirty bombs capable of changing the game. When the United States announced the comprehensive embargo, an emergency meeting convened in Havana. A decision was made in minutes. There was no hope of negotiation. No illusion of international support remained. Only a single option remained. If the regime must die, it would take its enemies with it. The order was activated, Operation Matty. Named for the national hero José Martí. 2 a.m. in Pinar del Rio. The ground trembled slightly. The heavy camouflage blast doors, weighing hundreds of tons, slowly opened, not exposing fixed launch pads, but mobile launch platforms, disguised as agricultural trucks, hauling sugarcane. Crude technology of the SS laid bare its deadly weakness, the liquid fueling process, an extremely volatile mixture of kerosene and nitric acid, dangerous for both enemy and operator alike. Cuban special teams, dressed in pressurized protective suits, worked in absolute silence. They knew that a single spark, a small mistake, would turn the whole area into a fireball. But the element of absolute surprise made up for every technological shortfall. American reconnaissance could detect the heat trail of a modern solid-fuel missile launch, but they were not programmed to seek out the faint signs of a liquid fuel fueling operation in the middle of the night in a remote valley. 2:10 a.m. For missiles were fully fueled. The primitive inertial guidance systems were activated. Coordinates were locked in. 2:14 a.m. The launch order was given. A roar tore through the night. 4 blinding orange-red columns of fire shot into the Caribbean sky. 4 monsters left their launchers. The targets were not Washington, nor New York. The Cubans knew the limits of their weapons. They aimed at both symbolic and strategic. The first 2 missiles were aimed directly at Homestead Air Force Base, home to reserve squadrons of F-16s and F-35s, America's fastest rapid response force in the region. The goal, to break the sword. The other 2 missiles targeted the Southern Command headquarters, Southcom in Doral. The objective, cut off the command's head. This was not a strike, meant for victory. The Cubans knew full well that once they launched the first missile, the total destruction of their island was inevitable. This was a suicidal, symbolic attack, a strike of nothing left to lose. They wanted to send one last message to Washington. If you push us to the edge, we will make sure the price you pay is unacceptable. America's shock was absolute. The entire intelligence machine, worth hundreds of billions of dollars, CIA, DJ, NSA, had all been outsmarted. They had spent too much time tracking digital threats, cyber attacks and Russian or Chinese hypersonic missiles. They had completely forgotten that the greatest threat sometimes doesn't come from the future, but is unearthed from the past. When the first bright traces appeared on radar, it was already too late for Florida. America's missile defense system was designed to counter ICBMs from Russia or China flying over the North Pole. It was not optimized to intercept medium-range ballistic missiles, slow-flying, launched from only 90 miles away. Inside the White House Situation Room, silence fell as the generals stood in shock. The threat they thought had ended, in their grandparents' time, had returned and dared to throw a nuclear punch at the face of America. In the underground Situation Room of the West Wing, the air was thick and freezing cold. The initial shock had passed. Only silence remained, and a restrained fury. The National Security Advisors, the Director, and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff were all present. On the screen was the image of the blazing infrared ruins of Homestead, and the radioactive cloud beginning to drift. America had been attacked with nuclear weapons. The final red line had been crossed. Every option was on the table. The first and most obvious choice was a nuclear retaliation in kind, a W-88 warhead from a Trident submarine leveling Havana, but that option was dismissed immediately. That was exactly what a desperate regime wanted, a martyr's death dragging the world with it. The U.S. president made a decision. The response would be non-nuclear, but its destructive power must be absolute, swift, and overwhelming. A message not only to Havana, but also to Moscow and Beijing. Never, ever, test America's resolve on its own soil. The order was issued. Operation Caribbean Tempest was activated. Phase 1. A Tomahawk tsunami was unleashed immediately beneath the blue waters of the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic. 4 Ohio-class nuclear submarines, converted to carry cruise missiles, rose quietly to launch depth. At the same time, 6 Alabama-class destroyers of the 4th Fleet formed a steel arc, sealing the island. The hatches of their vertical launch systems opened simultaneously. More than 200 Tomahawk Block V missiles screamed into the sky, leaving their launch tubes. They didn't fly high. They flew low, skimming over the waves, hugging the terrain, vanishing from Cuba's primitive radar screens. Their targets were not civilians. Their targets were the entire Military nerve system of Cuba. Early warning radar stations were destroyed first. The S-300 PMU air defense complexes, the pride of Havana, once purchased as deterrents, became priority targets, followed by the S-125 Pechora batteries and the mobile Panzer-S systems. A wave of Tomahawks struck military airfields, shattering runways, destroying aircraft shelters, command and control centers, naval ports, all engulfed in flames. Within the first 15 minutes, Cuba was blinded and declawed. Phase 2, the aerial tempest. Even before the last Tomahawk struck its target, Phase 2 had already begun. From bases in Florida and the Gulf of Mexico, squadrons of F-22 Raptors, the stealth predators, dove into Cuban airspace. Their mission, to establish total air dominance. The Cuban Revolutionary Air Force, outdated but brave, rose to fight. MiG-29 Fulcrums struggled to take off in desperation. From improvised runways, they climbed, seeking one honorable dogfight. But this was not a battle. It was an execution. F-22 pilots locked onto targets from over 60 miles away. AMRAAM missiles cut through the wings of night. The Cuban pilots received no warnings from their obsolete onboard systems. They saw nothing. They heard nothing. Only a streak on ground radar. And then eternal silence. One by one, MiG-29s exploded in the sky, like torches being snuffed out. Right behind the Predators came the Lightning. Squadrons of F-35 Lightning II, not just fighter jets, but airborne command centers, carrying electronic decoy missiles, MELD systems. The remaining S-300 batteries tried desperately to activate their radars. Immediately, their screens were flooded with hundreds of false signals, indistinguishable from real ones. They could no longer tell which blip was an F-35 and which was a decoy. While the Cuban radar crews struggled in confusion, the F-35's AGM-88E ARGM anti-radiation missiles locked onto their radar emissions. More explosions followed, and Cuba's final air defense network went dark. Cuba was completely paralyzed in less than 30 minutes. And then, the finishing blow came from Whiteman Air Force Base, Missouri. Flying high above all threats were the Phantoms, the B-2 Spirit stealth bombers, and the prototype B-21 Raider. Entering combat for the first time, they carried the most fearsome non-nuclear weapons, GBU-57 MOP bunker buster bombs. Their targets, the limestone caves of Sierra de los Órganos, where the attack had been born. The 31,000-pound bombs plunged, piercing dozens of feet of limestone, before detonating deep underground. An artificial earthquake shook all of western Cuba. The secret tunnels collapsed, burying everything inside forever. Operation Caribbean Tempest had succeeded. America had retaliated. But now the real game had just begun. Inside the Kremlin, President Putin called an emergency meeting of the National Security Council, not out of grief for Cuba, but out of outrage that America had acted unilaterally, using excessive. Right on the edge of Russia's sphere of influence, Putin announced that Russia's strategic nuclear deterrent forces were placed on special alert. This was not an idle threat. From northern bases, Yazan M-class nuclear attack submarines, and the doomsday submarine Belgorod, carrying Poseidon nuclear torpedoes, silently left port and dove deep into the Arctic Ocean. Moscow's message was crystal clear. We are not defending Cuba. We are deterring America from escalating any further. This crisis must remain confined to the Caribbean. But the most chilling response came from Beijing. Zhang Nanhai was eerily silent. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs of China issued only a formal statement, calling on all parties to show restraint. But at the same time, the South Sea Fleet and the Rocket Force of the Eastern Theater Command simultaneously received orders for large-scale drills. Without prior notice, the carrier Shandong left its base. Dozens of H-6K bombers, armed with cruise missiles, took off, while Dongfeng missile brigades, equipped with DF-17 hypersonic weapons, were reportedly moving into launch positions. The purpose of the exercise, a full encirclement of Taiwan. Beijing's intentions were unmistakable. They didn't care about Havana. They were seizing a once-in-a-millennium opportunity, while all of Washington's attention, all its satellites, and all its rapid response forces were tied up in the Caribbean. Could Washington summon the strength and resolve to intervene in a second crisis? On the opposite side of the globe, China was testing America's reaction to see if, when stretched across two fronts, the world's leading superpower would hesitate or stand firm. Washington believed that Operation Caribbean Tempest was over. They had broken the fangs, blinded and dismantled the nerve system of the Cuban Revolutionary Armed Forces. The Pentagon prepared to declare that Cuba had been completely neutralized, but war is never that simple. At that very moment, an urgent encrypted report at the highest security level arrived from the ground. The intelligence wasn't from satellites. It came from muddy boots on the ground. A Delta Force team had successfully infiltrated Pinar del Rio. Before the attack even began, they had just reported in. The GBU-57 MOP bunker-buster bombs had destroyed the main cave complex, but they had missed one target, a secondary facility, much smaller and perfectly camouflaged, hidden deeper in another valley. And inside it was not a storage site, but two remaining R-12 launchers. Delta's report made the generals at the Pentagon's hair stand on end. Those two missiles were being fueled in desperation, at full speed, but the worst part was their target. The Delta team intercepted the last radio transmission from the Cuban launch crew. The coordinates weren't for a military base, not for Washington or New York. The locked coordinates were for the Turkey Point nuclear power plant, just south of Miami. The Situation Room froze once again. This was no longer a military retaliation. This was the final act of a dying regime. The Deadland Plan. Havana knew it had lost. The government was collapsing, but if they were to fall, they would create a Chernobyl-scale disaster. On U.S. soil itself, they wanted to turn Florida into a radioactive wasteland for 10,000 years. The U.S. president now faced a choice beyond imagination. He had promised a non-nuclear response. But now what? Time was running out. Tomahawks couldn't be used. They were too slow. The R-12s would launch long before they arrived. F-35s couldn't be used either. The Delta team reported. The launchers were shielded by a dense ring of low-altitude defenses, likely ZSU-23-4S or SA-13s, capable of taking down a low-flying stealth fighter. The GBU-57s were out of the question. AB-2 would take hours to reach from Missouri, and by then, Miami would already be history. There was only one option left, an option that shattered every commitment, every doctrine of deterrence. He had to break his own promise, not to use nuclear weapons in this conflict. The decision was made within seconds. The order was issued, Operation Surgical Strike. This wasn't AB-2. This wasn't an F-35. From a dry, secret runway at Groom Lake, Nevada, also known as Area 51, a black object, sleek and flat, without a tail, sliced through the desert air. Intelligence circles speculated it was the State Route 72 Dark Star, an unmanned hypersonic vehicle, a true game-changing weapon. It accelerated Mach 5, Mach 6, Mach 7, flying at the edge of space, so high that the sky above turned pitch black, even in daylight. It crossed the Gulf of Mexico in less than 15 minutes. Cuba's shattered radar network registered not a single blip. It carried no heavy payload of bombs, only one weapon, tucked neatly into its bay, a B-61-12 tactical nuclear bomb. This was not a weapon of mass destruction. It was a surgeon's scalpel, a precision bomb guided by GPS and inertial systems. And most importantly, its explosive yield could be adjusted mid-flight, above Pinar del Rio. The bomb bay opened. The B-61-12 was released. It didn't simply fall. Its small rocket motor ignited, turning it into a guided glide bomb. It plunged downward, piercing through the atmosphere at unimaginable speed, locking onto the heat signature of the bunker. Designated by the Delta team, it penetrated 100 feet through solid limestone. Before the smart fuse detonated, the yield had been set to its lowest level, barely 0.3 kilotons, just 1/50th the power of the Hiroshima bomb. No mushroom cloud rose into the sky. Only a deep exhale, a sudden pulse of compressed air from the ground. A localized earthquake shook the entire valley. The underground complex collapsed instantly, melting from within. The radiation was contained almost entirely underground. The last two R-12 missiles and their desperate crew vaporized before they could press the launch button. The threat was erased. The game was over. Hours later, news came from Havana. Once they learned their final strike had failed, the government collapsed. Military units across the country raised white flags. From the amphibious assault ships of the Wasp-class waiting offshore, U.S. Marines began landing at Havana Harbor. It was not an invasion. Their mission was to stabilize the situation, to secure vital infrastructure, and to begin the largest hunt for weapons of mass destruction in modern history. But the B-61-12 strike wasn't just meant for Cuba. It was a message sent directly to two observers, watching closely. Moscow and Beijing, inside the Kremlin. The air was heavy. Putin and his generals were stunned. Utterly stunned. Not because America dared use a nuclear weapon. In that situation, they would have done the same. They were shocked by the speed and precision. From the moment Delta detected the final threat, to the moment it was eliminated by a hypersonic strike, launched from within U.S. territory, just 12 minutes had passed. Russia's Kinzhal and Avangard missiles might be fast, but America's detection-to-destruction chain had just proven itself on a terrifying new level. The technology gap was real. Putin understood that America's red line was now drawn in cold steel. He quietly ordered the Yazan and Belgorod submarines to withdraw to strategic defensive positions. The nuclear standoff in the Caribbean was over, but the most dramatic reaction came from Beijing. Almost simultaneously with the 0.3 kiloton detonation in Cuba, the massive exercise encircling Taiwan suddenly de-escalated. The H-6K bombers circling above received immediate orders to turn back and return to base. The Dongfeng missile brigades, which had been on high alert, received orders to stand down. China's Politburo had calculated that the United States, fearing a full-scale nuclear escalation, would never dare intervene militarily directly over Taiwan if China acted quickly and decisively. But the Cuban scenario had proven the opposite. They had just realized a chilling truth. When U.S. soil is attacked directly, Washington is willing to use every weapon, including highly precise tactical nukes, to end a conflict swiftly and decisively. They don't play by Beijing's rules. They play by Washington's. The balance in the South China Sea and Taiwan Strait shifted abruptly in that moment. China's military adventurism had just been dealt a massive question mark. The 72-hour war had ended. A cold dawn rose over a Caribbean island. Forever changed. Cuba lay in silence. U.S. Marines had established security perimeters around Havana, not as an occupying army, but as a temporary military administration. Their top priority: Operation Radiation Cleanup, a massive-scale mission to search for and neutralize any remnants of the Soviet-era secret weapons program. The missile crisis had been resolved by force, not diplomacy. But the world was forever changed. A new and far more dangerous order had emerged. Nuclear powers realized a horrifying truth. The greatest threat does not always come of modern ICBMs, worth trillions of dollars. The threat could come from forgotten weapons, left dormant for decades in the hands of a desperate nation, a nation cornered with nothing left to lose. The first lesson: the danger of strangulation tactics, of extreme embargoes meant to topple regimes. They are a double-edged sword. They can bring collapse, or it can create a monster willing to self-destruct and drag its enemies down with it. Havana had proven that. The second lesson was the redefinition of deterrence. Nuclear deterrence was no longer about warhead count. It was now defined by three factors. First, Cuba's will, its readiness to die together. Second, technology, the speed and hypersonic precision of the United States. And third, the calculated silence of the remaining great powers. Russia and China had learned that when U.S. territory is directly threatened, every rule of the game can be thrown aside. And finally, a lesson for ourselves. A lesson for Vietnam. This scenario, though hypothetical, reveals the fragility of peace and the cruelty of geopolitical chess. It emphasizes the vital importance of an independent and self-reliant foreign policy, one that is multilateral and diversified. Vietnam's bamboo must be flexible, but its roots must hold deep. We must never allow ourselves to be cornered like Cuba was. We must never allow ourselves to become a sacrificial pawn in the confrontation of any superpower. A nation's strength does not lie only in its missiles or tanks. True strength lies in wisdom, in righteousness, and a cool head. We must be strong enough to defend our sovereignty, but that strength must be guided by intellect, not by reckless emotion. Because in the 21st century, the line between a heroic deterrent strike and a suicidal act of destruction is razor thin. To preserve peace, with a cool head and a warm heart,